He saw it before anyone said it out loud. The tank wasn't slowing down, and if he waited like the manual told him to, they would not get another chance. The street ahead narrowed into broken stone and shadow, and somewhere inside it, a German gun was already turning toward them. Every crew had been trained the same way. Stop, aim, fire. But stopping here meant giving the other side time. Time they did not have. His hands moved before the order came, adjusting for motion, for distance, for a target that wasn't where it would be, but where it was going to be. In that instant, he chose a skill no one had taught him over a rule everyone trusted. And that single choice would not end with the tank in his sights. It would follow him long after the battle was over. If this story pulls you in, make sure to hit like and subscribe, because what happened next doesn't just change a battle, it changes everything that comes after. The Army trained thousands of tank gunners, but it trained them for a version of war that moved slower than reality. Manuals described clean engagements, controlled distances, predictable timing, a sequence where a crew could stop, stabilize, aim, and fire with precision. That method worked on open ground, where space gave time and time allowed procedure. But by early 1945, that version of war was already collapsing, and the system had not caught up. American doctrine still treated tanks as support tools, not hunters, and it avoided direct duels whenever possible. The assumption was simple. If you followed the process, you would survive long enough to complete the mission. What the process never accounted for was what happened when survival depended on breaking it. Clarence Smoyer did not learn his most important skill inside a tank. He learned it long before the uniform, in a life that had nothing to do with armored warfare. In Pennsylvania, where he grew up, work demanded coordination more than strength. Lifting, aligning, judging distance by instinct rather than measurement. Small errors mattered, and hesitation cost time that could not be recovered. That environment built something the Army did not measure: the ability to predict motion without thinking about it. When he first trained on tank guns, that instinct translated in ways instructors noticed but did not prioritize. Targets on a range did not move unpredictably, and training rewarded those who followed steps exactly as written. Smoyer could do that, but what stood out was how he adjusted when conditions changed. When angles shifted, when timing compressed, when the expected pattern broke. The system did not consider that a core skill, it considered it a variation. In official terms, consistency mattered more than improvisation. A gunner who followed procedure was reliable. A gunner who adapted was unpredictable. The difference between those labels would not matter in controlled training, but it would define what happened in a city that no longer followed rules. By the time American forces pushed deeper into Germany, reports had already made one thing clear. The enemy did not fight according to expectations. German tank crews used positioning and timing, not just firepower, and they did not wait for clean engagements. They struck first, often from angles that manuals barely addressed. Still, the response from higher command was slow to change. Adjusting doctrine required admitting that the existing system was incomplete, and institutions resist that kind of admission even when evidence is visible. Instead, the gap between training and reality widened, and individual crews were left to bridge it on their own. Smoyer did not see himself as someone breaking rules. From his perspective, he was solving a problem the only way that made sense in the moment. When a target moved, you did not wait for it to stop if stopping meant losing the opportunity. You compensated, you predicted, you acted. That logic came from outside the military framework, and because it came from outside, it was invisible to the system that evaluated him. No report would ever list civilian reflex adaptation as a defining advantage. No instructor would rewrite a manual to include it. Yet in practice, it was exactly the kind of skill the battlefield was beginning to demand. There was another factor the system underestimated: how quickly a single successful decision could reshape behavior. Training builds habits slowly, through repetition, but real outcomes reinforce them instantly. If a deviation from protocol leads to survival, the mind does not treat it as an exception, it treats it as confirmation. That mechanism is not taught, and it is not easily controlled. It becomes the start of a chain, where one decision influences the next, not through orders, but through memory. At this stage, That chain had not fully formed yet, but the conditions for it were already in place. The doctrine said one thing, experience was beginning to suggest another. And in between those two forces stood individuals who had to decide, in fractions of a second, which one to trust. The army could not adapt fast enough to rewrite its own rules before the next engagement. That meant the responsibility shifted downward, from system to soldier, from instruction to instinct. In theory, that made the battlefield more dangerous. In practice, it created moments where the outcome depended on something the system never intended to rely on. Someone else saw the difference before the battlefield ever forced it into the open. His name was Staff Sergeant Daniel Harker, a maintenance chief assigned to oversee the Pershing units when they first arrived in Europe in early 1945. Harker was not part of the official training pipeline, and that distance gave him a different perspective. He spent more time watching crews handle machines than listening to how they were supposed to handle them, and that habit made him sensitive to details others ignored. During the brief familiarization period near the Belgian port where the new tanks were distributed, Harker stood behind crews as they ran through firing drills, not evaluating results on paper, but observing how each gunner reacted in the seconds before and after a shot. Most followed the expected rhythm, steady and controlled, waiting for stillness before committing. Smoyer did not always wait. Harker noticed it the first time during a live fire adjustment, when a minor misalignment forced the gunner to correct under pressure. Instead of resetting completely, Smoyer compensated mid-motion, adjusting for the tank's slight shift without breaking focus. The round struck closer to center than expected. It was not perfect, but it was fast, and more importantly, it revealed a pattern. Over the next days, Harker paid closer attention. Whenever a situation introduced unpredictability, Smoyer's performance improved relative to others, not worse. It was a reversal of what training predicted. Under stable conditions, everyone performed similarly. Under unstable conditions, the gap widened. Harker understood what that meant, not in formal language, but in practical terms. The battlefield was rarely stable. He approached one of the junior officers responsible for overseeing gunnery training and suggested additional drills that would force crews to engage while moving, or at least while adjusting to motion. The response was immediate and dismissive. Those drills were not part of the approved program. Introducing them would create inconsistency, and inconsistency was considered a liability. The system valued repeatability because repeatability could be measured, reported, and standardized across units. What Harker was proposing could not be easily quantified, and anything that could not be measured was difficult to justify. He tried again, framing it differently, emphasizing that urban combat would limit the ability to stop and stabilize. The officer acknowledged the point, but deferred to doctrine. Changes of that scale required authorization beyond their level, and there was no time to pursue it before deployment. The decision was not irrational from the system's perspective. Standardization reduces error across large groups, and armies depend on that principle to function. But that same principle can also filter out outliers, even when those outliers represent potential advantages in specific conditions. Harker recognized that tension, though he did not describe it in those terms. He saw a skill that did not fit the framework, and he understood that the framework would not adjust quickly enough to include it. Without formal approval, he could not alter official training, but he adapted in smaller ways. During maintenance checks, he would ask Smoyer to explain how he adjusted for movement, prompting him to articulate something that had previously been instinctive. These conversations were informal, almost incidental, but they served a purpose. They turned an unconscious ability into a more deliberate process, even if it never appeared in any manual. The rest of the crew treated these exchanges as routine, not realizing they were refining something the system had overlooked. This quiet reinforcement mattered because skills that remain unexamined tend to remain inconsistent. By forcing reflection, Harker helped stabilize what would otherwise have been unpredictable. Still, his influence had limits. Once the tanks moved toward the front, the environment would dictate everything, and there would be no controlled space left for experimentation. Harker knew that, and he also knew he would not be there when it mattered. His role ended before the first engagement, replaced by conditions no one could fully prepare for. In a broader sense, this moment highlighted a recurring pattern within complex systems. Individuals at lower levels often detect emerging needs before the structure above them acknowledges those needs. But without authority, their observations remain localized. When the system finally encounters the problem at scale, it does so without having integrated the solutions that were already visible in smaller contexts. In this case, the gap was not about equipment or firepower. It was about timing, perception, and the willingness to act without waiting for confirmation. Those qualities are difficult to formalize because they depend on judgment rather than procedure. Yet they are exactly what unpredictable environments demand. By the time the Pershing units were committed to combat operations, the opportunity to incorporate these insights into official doctrine had already passed. What remained was a set of individuals carrying fragments of adaptation that had never been fully recognized or validated. Whether those fragments would make a difference depended on circumstances that no manual could anticipate. Cologne changed the conditions faster than any doctrine could respond. By early March 1945, the city no longer resembled a structured battlefield, but a fractured environment where visibility collapsed and timing compressed into seconds. Streets narrowed without warning, debris blocked predictable routes, and every intersection created angles that could not be fully covered by standard positioning. The Pershing crews entering the city carried equipment designed to outperform older tanks, yet the advantage depended entirely on how it was used. The system still assumed that superior armor and firepower would compensate for uncertainty, but uncertainty was no longer occasional. It was constant. Within this setting, the distinction between following procedure and adapting to reality became immediate rather than theoretical. As Eagle 7 advanced through the outskirts, the crew began encountering situations that did not match anything practiced during training. Movement slowed not because of caution alone, but because the environment forced continuous adjustment. The driver navigated around collapsed structures that shifted the tank's orientation unexpectedly, while the gunner faced targets that appeared and disappeared within fractions of time, too brief for deliberate alignment. Each stop introduced vulnerability, yet each movement reduced stability. The system had treated these factors separately, but in Cologne they existed simultaneously, creating a conflict that no manual resolved. Reports from nearby units confirmed that conventional approaches were failing under these conditions. Tanks that paused to establish precise firing positions exposed themselves to threats positioned at angles outside their immediate field of control. Infantry support struggled to keep pace through obstructed terrain, leaving armored units temporarily isolated in spaces where threats could emerge from multiple directions at once. The theoretical advantage of coordination broke down as communication lagged behind the speed of engagement. In this environment, the margin for hesitation narrowed to the point where waiting for confirmation could be more dangerous than acting without it. Smoyer's role within the crew placed him at the center of that tension. His responsibility was not simply to fire accurately, but to decide when accuracy mattered more than timing. The distinction sounds technical, yet it carried direct consequences. A perfectly aimed shot that came too late had no value, while a less precise shot delivered at the right moment could determine survival. The training system emphasized the first outcome because it could be measured and replicated, but the battlefield increasingly rewarded the second because it aligned with how engagements actually unfolded. As the Pershing moved deeper into the city, Smoyer began making small adjustments that were not explicitly ordered. He tracked movement differently, not waiting for targets to settle into predictable positions, but anticipating where they would emerge based on partial information. This approach required accepting a degree of uncertainty that training discouraged, yet it also reduced the delay between recognition and action. The crew did not formally discuss these changes, but they experienced the results. Situations that might have resulted in missed opportunities instead resolved quickly, reinforcing the effectiveness of the adjustment without labeling it as such. This is how informal adaptation often develops within rigid systems. It operates below the level of official acknowledgement, validated only by immediate outcomes. The environment itself reinforced this shift. Buildings created blind spots that invalidated long-range calculations, forcing engagements into shorter distances where reaction time mattered more than ballistic precision. Sound echoed unpredictably, making it difficult to determine direction before visual confirmations. Under these conditions, the assumption that a crew could always prepare before firing became unrealistic. Instead, preparation and execution merged into a single continuous action. The system had separated them into distinct steps for clarity, but reality recombined them out of necessity. Each adjustment Smoyer made was small in isolation, yet together they formed a pattern that diverged from standard practice. That divergence did not immediately appear significant because it did not conflict with orders in a visible way. He still operated within the crew structure, still responded to commands, still used the same equipment. The difference existed in timing, in the fraction of a second between seeing and acting. Those fractions accumulated, and with each instance, the internal threshold for decision-making shifted slightly. What had once required confirmation began to feel immediate. This gradual change illustrates how domino effects often begin, not with a single dramatic event, but with a series of minor deviations that redefine what feels normal. By the time a critical moment arrives, the individual is no longer choosing between two clearly defined options, but acting according to a pattern that has already been established. In Cologne, the system did not collapse in a single failure. It eroded through repeated encounters that exposed its limitations, transferring responsibility from doctrine to individual judgment. The Pershing's capabilities remained constant, but the way those capabilities were applied depended increasingly on decisions made in compressed timeframes. Within that compression, the difference between survival and loss was no longer determined by adherence to procedure, but by the ability to recognize when procedure no longer applied. That recognition was not taught, and it could not be standardized, yet it was becoming the most critical factor on the field. The moment did not arrive as a clear choice, but as a collapse of time where every option overlapped. Eagle 7 moved into a wider street that offered visibility but removed protection, and that trade-off forced decisions faster than commands could be spoken. Somewhere ahead, a German Panther had already established position, not waiting in open view, but angled in a way that controlled the approach without revealing itself completely. This was not a duel arranged by distance and preparation. It was an intersection of timing where whoever acted first would define what followed. The crew inside the Pershing understood the general threat, but understanding did not translate into a coordinated sequence. The system expected a chain of actions: identify, stop, aim, fire. Yet the environment compressed those steps into something that could not be separated. When the Panther appeared within the gunner's sightline, it was already moving, already adjusting, already part of a dynamic situation that did not allow for stabilization. Smoyer recognized that delay would not create clarity. It would remove opportunity. His hands moved with a pattern that had been forming long before this instant, compensating for motion rather than resisting it. He did not wait for the tank to settle because he understood that the target would not wait either. The decision to fire while moving was not framed as breaking a rule. It was framed as responding to a condition where the rule no longer applied. That distinction mattered because it removed hesitation. Hesitation is often the product of conflicting instructions, but in this case, the conflict had already been resolved internally through previous adjustments. The shot left the barrel while the vehicle continued forward, and in that fraction of time, the difference between doctrine and adaptation became visible in outcome. The first impact did not immediately end the engagement, but it disrupted the sequence the Panther crew depended on. Their expectation was that the American tank would stop before firing, creating a predictable window for return fire. When that expectation failed, their timing shifted, and with it, their ability to respond effectively. The second shot followed under conditions that now favored continuity rather than reset. Because Smoyer had already committed to motion-based engagement, He did not need to reestablish alignment from a stationary position. The adjustment carried forward, allowing the next action to occur without interruption. This continuity is often overlooked in analysis, yet it represents a critical advantage. Systems that require resetting between steps lose time, and in compressed environments, that loss is decisive. The Panthers' attempt to recover position came too late to restore balance. Within seconds, the engagement concluded, not because one side possessed overwhelming superiority, but because one side operated within a framework that matched the environment more closely. The outcome reinforced a pattern that had been developing incrementally. A decision that deviated from training produced a successful result under pressure, and that success did more than resolve the immediate threat. It validated the internal logic that had guided the action. In cognitive terms, this is where reinforcement begins to shape future behavior. The mind does not separate the decision from the result. It links them directly, strengthening the association between adaptation and survival. From this point forward, similar conditions would not be approached as uncertain experiments, but as scenarios where a proven method could be applied again. This is the beginning of the domino effect in its most subtle form. The first tile does not appear significant because it blends into the surrounding pattern. Yet once it falls, the direction of movement becomes difficult to reverse. The crew inside Eagle 7 experienced relief, but beneath that relief, a shift had occurred that none of them fully articulated. The system they had been trained to rely on had been supplemented, if not partially replaced, by a method that existed outside official instruction. That method had now demonstrated effectiveness against one of the most dangerous threats on the field. In isolation, the event could be recorded as a successful engagement, an example of a superior tank overcoming an opponent. But that interpretation would miss the underlying mechanism that produced the result. The Pershing's capabilities provided the possibility, but the execution depended on a decision that the system neither taught nor encouraged. The difference between possibility and outcome lay in the willingness to act without waiting for the environment to conform to expectations. That willingness carried forward, not as a conscious strategy, but as an embedded response shaped by immediate validation. From a structural perspective, this moment revealed a gap between design and application. Equipment is developed with certain assumptions about how it will be used, and training reinforces those assumptions. When real conditions diverge, the effectiveness of that equipment depends on whether users can adapt beyond those assumptions. In this case, adaptation closed the gap, but it also introduced variability that the system could not easily track or control. That variability is both strength and risk, because it produces results that cannot be predicted with the same reliability as standardized procedures. The engagement ended quickly, yet its implications extended beyond the immediate scene. A single decision had altered not only the outcome of that encounter, but the internal framework through which future decisions would be made. The chain had advanced one step, and the next step would not occur under the same conditions, but it would carry the influence of this one. The next engagement did not announce itself as a continuation, yet it carried the full weight of what had already been set in motion. Movement through the city resumed under conditions that appeared similar on the surface, but internally, something had shifted. The crew operated with a confidence shaped not by instruction, but by recent success, and that confidence altered how quickly decisions were made. Where hesitation might once have existed, there was now a reduced threshold between recognition and action. This change was subtle, almost invisible, yet it represented a critical transition in how judgment functioned under pressure. The environment remained unpredictable, with narrow streets intersecting at irregular angles and limited visibility forcing reliance on fragments of information. Within that uncertainty, any moving object carried potential threat, and the cost of misjudging that threat could be immediate. When a dark vehicle entered the intersection ahead at speed, it did not present itself as clearly identifiable. It appeared suddenly, crossing from one line of sight to another, its motion conflicting with expectations of what should or should not be present in that space. The system offered no specific guidance for this scenario. only general principles about engagement and caution, but those principles required time to interpret. Time, in this case, was compressed into seconds that did not allow for full evaluation. Smoyer's response followed the pattern that had been reinforced moments earlier. He did not analyze the situation through a structured checklist. He reacted through a process shaped by motion, speed, and perceived intent. The vehicle's movement suggested urgency, and urgency in a combat zone often correlates with threat. That association was not irrational, but it was incomplete. Acting on it required committing before all variables were known. The trigger was pulled under the same internal logic that had produced success against the Panther, yet the context differed in ways that were not immediately visible. This is where the domino effect reveals its complexity. A decision that proves effective in one situation establishes a pathway that the mind is inclined to follow again, even when conditions are not identical. The brain prioritizes patterns that have recently led to survival, reinforcing them as reliable responses. However, reliability in one context does not guarantee accuracy in another. The system's inability to incorporate this nuance leaves individuals to navigate the transition on their own. In this instance, the pattern continued forward without interruption, and the action unfolded before reassessment could occur. The vehicle reacted to the impact, its movement disrupted, its trajectory ending within the intersection. Only after the sequence completed did the ambiguity of the situation become apparent. What had initially appeared as a potential threat did not behave like one under closer observation. The absence of return fire, the lack of coordinated response, and the nature of the vehicle itself introduced doubt where certainty had existed moments before. That shift from certainty to doubt is not gradual. It is immediate and often disorienting. The same cognitive process that enables rapid action can also delay the recognition of error because it prioritizes completion over reconsideration. Inside the tank, there was no immediate framework for interpreting what had just occurred. The system did not provide a clear category for events that fell between engagement and mistake. Reports could later classify outcomes, but in the moment, the distinction remained unresolved. This ambiguity is a defining characteristic of high-pressure decision-making environments. SOCSIMs are taken with incomplete information, and the consequences of those actions are not always immediately interpretable. For Smoyer, the realization did not come as a single clear conclusion, but as a gradual accumulation of details that did not align with the initial assumption. Each detail introduced friction into the certainty that had driven the action, and that friction altered how the event was processed internally. The skill that had enabled rapid response did not include a mechanism for immediate reversal, and once the sequence began, it followed through to completion. From a broader perspective, this moment illustrates the dual nature of adaptive behavior. The same capability that allows an individual to outperform rigid systems under certain conditions can also produce outcomes that the system is designed to prevent. The difference lies not in the skill itself, but in the context in which it is applied. Systems attempt to manage this by enforcing consistent procedures, reducing variability at the cost of flexibility. When individuals operate outside those procedures, they gain flexibility but also assume responsibility for outcomes that cannot be fully predicted. The transition between these states is not clearly marked, and it often occurs without conscious recognition. In the sequence of events unfolding in Cologne, the earlier success had shifted the balance toward flexibility, and with that shift came an increased exposure to uncertainty. The chain of decisions continued to move forward, each link connected not by explicit planning, but by the reinforcement of prior outcomes. What had begun as a necessary adjustment to a failing system now extended into situations where the boundaries between threat and non-threat were less defined. The system could not intervene quickly enough to recalibrate behavior, and the individual could not fully reconstruct the decision once it had been executed. The result existed in a space where responsibility was clear, but certainty was not. Years passed, but the structure of that day never fully settled into a single, stable meaning. Time moved forward in the ordinary ways. Work, family, routine, but the decisions made in seconds remained fixed, unchanged by distance or explanation. What complicated those memories was not only what had happened, but how it had happened. The same process that had preserved life in one moment had carried forward into another, where the outcome no longer aligned with intention. This is the aspect of experience that systems rarely address. They measure results, but they do not resolve the internal contradictions created by those results. For Smoyer, the events in Cologne did not separate into clear categories of right or wrong. They existed as connected points in a sequence where each action influenced the next, and where removing one decision would alter everything that followed. Decades later, when he returned to the city, the physical environment had changed, but the structure of that sequence remained intact. Streets had been rebuilt, damage repaired, and daily life restored. Yet, the question embedded in that day had not been resolved. Meeting Gustav Schaefer brought that question into focus in a way that time alone could not. Both men had occupied different sides of the same environment, responding to similar pressures with different roles, yet arriving at a shared uncertainty. Neither could determine with certainty how responsibility should be assigned, because the event itself did not provide a clear answer. This uncertainty is not a failure of memory, but a reflection of how complex decisions function under pressure. Outcomes emerge from interactions between intention, perception, and incomplete information, and isolating a single cause often oversimplifies what actually occurred. In their conversation, the emphasis did not fall on assigning blame, but on recognizing the limits of what either of them could have known in that moment. That recognition did not erase the consequences, but it reframed them within a context that acknowledged uncertainty rather than ignoring it. The passage of time had not reduced the weight of the decisions, but it had changed how they were understood. Early interpretations tend to focus on immediate results: survival, loss, success, failure, while later reflections consider the processes that produced those results. In this case, the process was shaped by a combination of training, personal skill, environmental pressure, and the rapid reinforcement of prior outcomes. Each element contributed, and none operated in isolation. The system provided a foundation, but it did not account for every variable. The individual filled that gap, not through formal instruction, but through adaptation. That adaptation proved effective in one context and uncertain in another, illustrating the limits of both structured systems and individual judgment. Neither approach guarantees consistent outcomes when conditions shift beyond what either was designed to handle. What remains is the recognition that decisions made under pressure carry forward in ways that extend beyond their immediate effects. They influence future behavior, shape interpretation, and create connections that may only become visible much later. In Cologne, one decision altered the timing of an engagement and contributed to a favorable result. That same pattern of response continued into a different situation, producing an outcome that could not be reconciled as easily. The link between those moments is not always acknowledged, yet it is essential to understanding how cause and effect operate in complex environments. If the initial decision had been different, the sequence would have changed, but there is no way to determine with certainty whether that change would have led to better or worse outcomes. This uncertainty is often uncomfortable because it resists simple conclusions. It does not allow for clear narratives where every action leads to a predictable result. Instead, it presents a reality where effectiveness and consequence are intertwined and where the same capability can produce opposing outcomes depending on context. For viewers looking at this story from a distance, the lesson does not lie in identifying a single correct choice, but in understanding how decisions function within systems that are themselves incomplete. Skills developed outside formal structures can provide advantages that those structures overlook, especially when conditions change rapidly. At the same time, those skills operate without the safeguards that structured systems attempt to provide, increasing the range of possible outcomes. The balance between these factors is not fixed. It shifts with context, and individuals must navigate that shift in real time. The story does not end with a definitive resolution because the conditions that produced it do not lead to definitive answers. What it offers instead is a perspective on how small decisions, made under pressure, can extend far beyond their original moment, shaping not only immediate outcomes, but also the way those outcomes are understood over time. In that sense, the most important question is not whether the decision was right or wrong, but how it changed everything that came after, in ways that neither the system nor the individual could fully predict.